My name is Waliur Rahman. I have been teaching literary theory and criticism at master level in Central University of Rajasthan, Kishangarh, Ajmer. Today we will talk about literary theory and criticism, about its nature and ideological interpretations of theorists, ranging from T.S. Eliot to Jacques Derrida and after. Let us start what literary theory is and how it is different from criticism in classical sense. You must understand it that the idea of criticism and theory has been evolved for the analysis of a work of art. But when we talk about the subject of literary theory and criticism, or say subjects of literary theory and criticism, we must pay attention on the genres, the branches of literature. There are many similarities, and at the same time, there are differences between these two subjects, criticism and theory. We will talk about it later. First, let us understand what these two terms mean. Criticism literally refers to an act of judgment. It is borrowed from Latin criticus, Greek kritikos, from kritos, which means a judge. So a critic is a judge in classical sense who passes a value judgment of a work of art. A critic thinks a piece of art as a work, a composite work, a composition, which cannot be possible without its specific or specified artistry devices. That is why criticism has some limitation. Its subjects are limited. It talks about a specific genre. It talks about specific branch of literature. It talks about some certain limitations of which a work of art is made. Whereas theory is entirely different, though both are having similar aspects as well. I will talk about it later. Theory literally refers to speculation. By knowing the literal meanings of these two terms, you will be able to understand how theory is entirely different from criticism. Theory literally refers to speculation, contemplation. It has been borrowed from Latin word theoria, which stands for, in general, a process. Remember this process, the word, a supposition of thinking, speculating about something. It has enormous genre as subject matters of its own. It doesn't have limitation of study of a work of art. It thinks or it teaches you how to think a composition as a text, how to think a work of art as a text. Text, texture, interwoven work. Thus, its activity means the activity of theory or theory as an act of speculation does not end at a certain level of understanding. It asks you, it is a kind of technique or some kind of intellectual process through which you go and start framing ideas upon ideas from an idea to another idea by relating them as well. Thus, theory is based on intervention, conception, and investigation, whereas criticism has its limitation only to the judgment of a work of art. Theory and criticism are similar in their nature. As I told you that there are some similarities of both theory and criticism. When we talk of the nature of these two tools of literature, or say approaches to literature, then we will find some similarities of the nature of both theory and criticism. See, the job of a theorist and a critic decides the nature of theory and criticism. The job of a theorist is to analysis, is to make an exposition, expunction, correction, and to give some new critical idea. I used critical, I will later define it, what it means. But they are at the same time, they are different when we think about critic's job or theorist's job. As men of analysis, as men of exposition, expunction, correction, and viewer of critical thoughts. A critic is analytic in his approach to literature, but his analysis limits himself. He limits as well, he limits his idea upon a work of art to the subject matters of that particular art or that particular work. He doesn't intentionally or unintentionally, consciously or unconsciously, he does not want to go beyond the subject matter of a subject or the subject of a work of art. He doesn't want to be interlinked with other disciplines. Say, for example, he will not read poetry in relation to psychology. He will not, or he will feel odd to go beyond the area of poetry. He will concentrate on the devices used in the poetry, subject matters about what the poet has talked about. He will not go beyond it. In this manner, he limits himself. He thinks it is not his job. A critic thus does not go beyond the limitation of the subject matters given in a poem, whereas a theorist may go beyond. A theorist thinks about or speculates about that idea which is not or which cannot be simply found out in that poem. He intentionally goes beyond in a process of reading, or while reading that particular poem, he goes beyond that poem and speculates something that may or may not be in the mind of poet himself, or that may or may not be related to the subject matters of his poems or poetry. Thus you may understand basic difference between criticism and theory, or a man as a theorist and a critic. That's why in the very beginning I told you criticism and theory both are having similar characteristics, but in that similarities, when we brood or when we deeply think, we will find some dissimilar elements are also there. We can thus conclude what literary theory is, being distinct from the approaches to a work of art explained till the period of Northrop Frye and Crane. Literary theory is the way to read texts, thinking that a work of art is a text, not a work. A theorist does not believe in the composition. If he believes in composition, he believes that composition is itself a deformative form of a work of art. Composition is entirely, when a theorist defines composition, he will define with some different angle or perspective. A theorist always goes through some peculiar lens, or say points of view, or say leitmotif. Leitmotif. There is a common assumption about theory that there is no right way to look at literature. A theorist does not have any right way, right within quote, right way or correct way to look at literature. And sometimes out of this assumption, people start misunderstanding the conceptualizations of theory. Basically, if you'll ask me, I'll say that this is what peculiarity of literary theory. Because a theorist thinks always each and every way of interpretation is the result of unique speculation. So each perspective or each way or lens or dimension with which he is reading a text or looking at literature becomes meaningful for him, because he thinks his perspective is the result of speculation. And contemplation. He broods over words. He has power to cull or borrow enormous connotation of a particular word. It depends on the mind or genius of a theorist. So this assumption of right way to look at literature must be thought in concern of theory positively. And it is one of the peculiar characteristics of literary theory. Why those ways or manners or perspectives of a theorist are thought unique? Because every thought is developed, or say develops develops itself at the time of reading a text. There is no right way to look at literature. Why? Because literature itself is not having any right dimension. It has a spectromatic dimension. It has power to reflect many things at a particular time. And in order to catch those particular things or thoughts or spectromatic effects or affects, you need to be diverted from a particular right within code right way to look at literature. Now we will talk about the common idea of, say, common people about theory. How do they think about theory? There are many connotations in general. Like theory is thought as guess, Guess. I have been hearing, say, listening to people talking about theory. They say theory goes on guess or assumptions of meaning. They don't have anything peculiar to say. Whatever they say, that becomes the point of theory, which is not true at all. Theory is not guess. I used speculation, the word, literal meaning, and I cannot deviate from this understanding. It is not guess. Why? Because it goes beyond hypothetical thoughts. It is formed out of hypothesis as a result of hypothesis itself. Even you or even a theorist guess, his guess will be based on some authentic and reasonable thought. Theory is thinking. It has also been noticed that people talk about theory in relation to thinking. Yes, I will agree. I agree with it. The reason being, there is no research without thinking, and each reading for a theorist is a result of thinking. So I am very much positive, and it is true if one interprets or understands theory in relation to speculation. Theory is also known as the part of philosophy. Jacques Derrida was a philosopher, Spinoza was a philosopher, Newton was a philosopher, Foucault was a philosopher, Descartes was a philosopher. These were all the philosophers. They had inclination toward reading and understanding philosophy and speaking on philosophy, but their thought overlaps philosophy. Why? Because they spoke on human nature, which is the subject of literature. And that's why theorist goes in the lap of philosophers. Unless he goes to the philosophers, to the world of philosopher, he cannot explain even a single word of literary speculation or literary work of art or say text. Theory has also been explained saying it stands for points of view. I would like to recall the idea of points of view of Henry James, who connected points of view to the life world. Undoubtedly, theory refers to the word points of view. There is no single point of view of literature for literature to literature. There are points of view, and we live in points of view of literature. So, when anybody talks about theory in relation to points of view, yes, of course it is acceptable. So, this is also one of the interpretive word for theory. Theory has also been explained in relation to idea. Many people talks about theory in relation to idea. Say the word ideology has been made of idea. The North of Right talks about the history of ideas. So idea in peculiar sense can be related to the idea of theory itself, or to the definition of theory itself. So these words may be standing for defining the word theory in general. First, guess. Second, thinking. Third, speculation. Fourth, philosophy. Fifth, points of view. And sixth, idea. All these are, and there are enormous words, many words one may pick from dictionary which can communicate or which can be identical to the interpretation of the word theory. Now we shall talk about theory as a literary branch. And I would suggest those who have inclination to become a theorist or to readers of theorists that they should think theory not as a separate part of epistemology. It is something I would suggest to you which you may not define in particular manner unless you think it as a genre which has unique characteristics, as I have explained so far, in relation to the connotations and other referential words. Unless we think literary theory as a genre, as an academic and a research genre, we cannot reach to the spirit of literary theory. Jonathan Culler, as an academician, has talked about theory as genre in his book, Literary Theory. And I would like to read some cited material here, which will clarify how theory can be thought as literary genre. I quote, "The philosopher Richard Rorty speaks of a new mixed genre that began in the 19th century. Quote, beginning in the days of Goethe and Macaulay and Carlyle and Emerson, a new kind of writing has developed which is neither the evolution of the relative merits of literary productions, nor intellectual history, nor moral philosophy, nor social prophecy, but all of these mingled together in a new genre." This is what one of the peculiar characteristics of what I have been trying to say you as characteristic of literary theory. Because literary theory communicates to miscellaneous genre by taking a particular genre. For example, if a literary theorist looks at a play, any play, written by any author, belonging to any country, state, no matter, he will read that work from that perspective through which meanings which embed that work can be extrapolated. He will not limit his idea upon that work of art by constraining himself to the limitation of that work. He will go beyond the limitation of the devices used by the author for writing that particular book and relates those ideas to the ideas given in philosophy, given in psychology, given in epistemology, given in anthropology, given in linguistics, etc., etc. As Althusser has done with Brecht in his book For Marx. He, in reading Karl Marx's idea on ideology as a distinct epistemological thought or ontological thought from his Marx's predecessors, relates those ideas to the plays of Bertolt Brecht and his art. Second example, Friedrich Jameson. In almost all his works, Friedrich Jameson gives many references in relation to examples and citations of Henry James. Jacques Derrida, in understanding Philippe Solar, Paul Celan, he discussed many philosophers and theological books and ideas of theology, etc. What trying to say is a theorist does not limit himself at the time of reading a work of art. He goes beyond the limitations of the subject matters contained in that particular work of art. That's why it should be thought, means theory should be thought as a particular or peculiar genre. That's it.